Good evening. I'm Dr. Greenbrier Almond, and thank you for joining us on our program, Tender Loving Care. Each week on Channel 3, for the past 35 years, we've been talking about issues involving this interface between Christianity and medicine. And tonight, we're going to talk about the signature of disaster, the signature disorder of disaster, and that's post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm bringing this up tonight because we have been yet once again found ourselves as a nation facing a disaster. I'm not going to mention the young man's name. I don't want to glorify him. But out in Aurora, Colorado, there was a gunman who came in to a crowded theater, the opening night of Batman, which would be a summer blockbuster movie, and opened fire on people who were just there to enjoy the movie. Innocent people, and 70 people were shot. 12 apparently have died. Maybe others will die. So it truly is a disaster. And but we need to understand, I think from a standpoint of neighbor helping neighbor, reaching out to one another, that there are things we can do to help prevent this disaster from turning into post-traumatic stress disorder, particularly in the most vulnerable people. So I'm going to talk tonight about some associations and some things that I, as a doctor, look at, and I know from my experience with the VA that the Veterans Affairs Department looks at in returning soldiers and those who certainly are exposed to all sorts of traumas and disasters in war. We've learned a lot about this in the last 30 years, going back to 1980 when this first became a known disorder. As you may know, it began in West Virginia in the early 70s with the Buffalo Creek disaster, in which 6 towns were wiped out, hundreds of people died, cars were ruined, houses were ruined, many people were traumatized who survived that rupture of that dam in southern West Virginia. And out of that, we by studying those people that survived, that's how we formulated what we call PTSD. The 3 parts that are commonly associated with this, first of all, when there's a disaster or a trauma, there's a feeling of helplessness. And not every person who feels helpless in a trauma setting will turn into having PTSD, but certainly many people, that's their experience. That's the beginning of it. Second feature is horror. Something is happening that's just so outside the range of normal. It's just horrible. It's horrifying. And to me, that shooting in the theater the other night was horrible, absolutely horrible. And then the third response is fear. And most of us will have that response anytime we're open to something that's strange or alarming to us. And that's our fight or flight or freeze response when the adrenaline rushes and we have fear. So those 3 are part of the signature of PTSD. I want to look at some associations, and to do that tonight, I've picked up at home the clinical manual of PTSD that I use often in my work with veterans. And I want to share with you just some thoughts from there, because I think it's important to get some idea in light of this fresh trauma of what we need to all be doing if we want to prevent PTSD, we want to manage it better, if we want to help people who are hurting from trauma. And so first of all, let's talk about what in medicine is commonly called the strength of associations. Some things are associated with each other. For example, obesity may be associated with heart disease. Not that one causes the other directly, but they tie together. So an association is in particularly in PTSD is that if someone has a particular traumatic event, but they've already been traumatized, or they already have a psychiatric disorder like depression or anxiety, then they're more likely to develop PTSD. It's an association. It doesn't prove one thing or another, but it's important to keep in mind. So there's always the most vulnerable among us, isn't there? There's people who need an extra helping hand all through their life. And those people, again, in the face of trauma, become the most vulnerable. In the movie theater, and I'm not sure why there were children in the movie theater, since it was a PG 13 or 14. It was just for teenagers or higher, but maybe children are there being babysat, or they came to the theater with their parents, whatever reason. There were children in the theater, and one young lady was actually killed. And those children, as example of an association, will be more vulnerable to PTSD because they don't have the coping skills that maybe an adult would have. A second thing is what we can call consistency of association. Again, I'm trying to talk in medical terms and then talk to you as a layperson, but make this reasonable so you can help your neighbor. An association is consistent through multiple studies. And for example, a consistent association with PTSD is depression and suicidality. And you may be aware that more people are dying in this current war that we're fighting in Afghanistan from suicide than are dying from war itself. Or you may be aware that young people who are vulnerable, the main three causes of death are homicide, suicide, and accidents. And suicide is certainly increasing, as is homicide in our country. So those are consistent associations. There's biological plausibility. Again, we're animals, aren't we? We have a Achilles heel in each of us. I love that story of the parents who wanted to make their child so strong they could never be wounded in battle, and they dipped him in a potion, Achilles, but they held on to his heel as they dipped him as a baby into that potion. And so, of course, where the parents held the hand around the heel of the baby, they didn't get the potion there, as so goes the Greek myth. And so when he grew up, he was a great soldier. He could not be wounded, but people then discovered, his enemies discovered, that he was vulnerable in the heel. They could wound him in the heel and inflict harm. So we all have, in our common expression today, an Achilles heel, some particular biological variability, something about us where we're most vulnerable. For many people, it's headache. If they're under stress, they have headache. If you want to test that hypothesis, go to the local drugstore. Look at the over-the-counter shelf. That's the longest, that has the most variety of medicines, and you'll see that it's headache potions of various kinds. I suppose the gut is right behind that, but you can check that out. We're vulnerable in different ways, biologically. Following exposure, there's a lot of people who will demonstrate hyper-vigilant behavior, and we can expect that. Again, they startle easily, they're always on guard, and the brain is protecting them from harm. So we know that there's a gland in the brain called the amygdala that actually enlarges after trauma. And when it enlarges, its idea is to survey our environment, seeking what may be dangerous for us. It could be a smell, a sound, a sight, something that will remind a person of a previous trauma. So we become hypervigilant. That's one of the biological alerts that goes on in our bodies. There's a dose-response relationship, again, in two different ways. 9/11, we learned that the people who lived closest to Canal Street or below Canal Street, where the World Trade Center was located, those people were most vulnerable for PTSD, about 70% of them. Almost as you mark off the streets in Manhattan going north toward the upper end of Manhattan, toward Harlem, there was less and less PTSD recorded. This was in self-report surveys. Now later on, some of those people, of course, didn't have PTSD, but this was surveys taken acutely. So the closer you are to the trauma, the more vulnerable you are. That makes some sense. And of course, if it's repeated trauma, there's more vulnerability. I see now soldiers who return from Afghanistan and Iraq, and they've been there 4 times or more on deployments. And so by the 4th time, they are really, really, really suspecting that they're going to be shot or killed this time. They feel bad about it. Some of them commit suicide before they go over for the 4th time or the 5th time or whatever it is. But the repeated trauma is what I'm talking about now, sets people up. So it's a dose-response relationship. Another thing is the temporal sequence. Which comes first, the cart or the horse? You know, the old saying here in the mountains. And of course, we put the horse first. But if a person has temporally depression and then they get traumatized, that sets them up for PTSD. But not all depression turns into PTSD. Not all PTSD has major depression as a part of it. It's an anxiety disorder. But there's that type of sequencing that we're interested in looking at. I remember when I was at the City of Faith working in Oral Roberts University. This happened to me. I was a psychiatrist on the staff, and the family medicine service asked me to consult to see a young lady who had the thickest chart in the medical center, and it was really thick. I think it was multiple volumes of charts. Every medical test in the world, every complaint in the world, really, she was complaining of, and so she was a pretty sick lady. As it turns out, the root of her problem was early childhood sexual abuse, PTSD, but it had resulted in a temporal sequencing to a number of somatizations, and every part of her body, in one sense, she felt vulnerable in, and that was part of her PTSD. Now, I want to talk again as we think back. This is all prompted by the shooting of 70 people in a movie theater in Aurora, Colorado. Again, not mentioning the person's name, but just wanting to talk about how we can help one another, how we can understand what's happening, our own vulnerabilities. If you are considering someone who may have been traumatized, there are certain things, first of all, at the individual level, at the trauma response level, which we are now because we're just a few days after the trauma, and particularly this will involve the people of Aurora, but as we watch it TV, for some of us this will be triggers for past trauma for us. And then finally there's, of course, post-trauma phase. I want to talk about this for a few minutes so that we can, again, plan a strategy. People with mental health history, of course, are most vulnerable for further mental health problems. That makes sense. Unfortunately, and I'm not against the female sex in any way at all, but the females are more vulnerable for PTSD than the men. And that comes out for a variety of reasons. Personality factors also figure. We have commonly, if you think of a continuum from left to right, a continuum, this is external locus of control, this is internal locus of control. People who are externally controlled by their environment are more vulnerable for PTSD. Now what do we mean by that? Well, the weather is an example of something external. We've had some horrendous weather here in West Virginia this summer. We had the derecho, we've had drought somewhat, now we've had multiple rainstorms, and all of that's unusual, but those are external events. Some people are really, really upset by that, and they have, in a sense, an external locus of control. Something like the weather really gets to them. Now there are internally controlled people who just go about their business in their day and they don't really care what kind of weather it is, even whether it's winter or summer or spring or fall. You know, they're oblivious to a lot of things, and they can be very internally controlled, and they're less vulnerable for PTSD. So that's the personality factors. There's people who have a lower socioeconomic status are more prone to PTSD. Again, this might be for early trauma, frequent moves. There's the old saying in the mountains, 3 moves are like a fire. We lose a lot when we move. People who are poor are moving from one apartment to another, and all this sets up vulnerability. Again, nothing against being poor. I'm sure people who are poor would rather be rich. People who are rich are blessed, and they need not think of themselves as better. But socioeconomically, it does set people up for PTSD. Lower education level is also a factor. Again, if we are more mature, we had more education, we have more coping skills. We know how to problem solve. And one of the things that I commonly do when I practice psychiatry and work with my patients, even those who may have medical issues, I'm wanting to be an educator to them. I'm wanting to teach them how to manage their own body, how to manage their illness, things they can do, options they have, you know, enough rest, enough exercise, proper diet, all the common things that we know help us be healthy. So higher education level, the less vulnerability there is to developing PTSD. Race becomes an issue, and people who are in minority status are more vulnerable to PTSD than those who are in the majority status. This comes about for various reasons. Again, there's a certain fear response that may be in their family life. Maybe they're walking around on eggshells, not wanting to create trauma in their life or turmoil in their school or anything like that. And anyway, they set up vulnerabilities if a person is from a minority ethnic group. Previous traumatic exposure, again, this is cumulative. We've talked about that before. So a person who's been, there was one young lady in this incident in Aurora. She had just been in Toronto, and she narrowly had avoided being killed in a mall setting there. Well, lo and behold, here she comes back home and she goes to a movie, and this time she is killed. But the people who get multiple traumas like that, of course, have a higher chance of PTSD. Another factor is family psychiatric history. This is not clear whether this is going to be genetic or like an Achilles heel setting, or the family environment, how they're taught. But if they grow up in a family that's somewhat dysfunctional, that sets up for PTSD. My experience in the military, working with soldiers, is that people who become soldiers actually are vulnerable in some ways. For example, the father may die when a young man's a teenager, and then this sets up a series of events which eventually leads him to joining the military. You could suppose that if the father had lived, he might go on, the young man might grow up and go on to college or make other career choices. But you see what I'm talking about. A family environment has a factor in PTSD. Age is a factor. The very young are more vulnerable, and the very old. I remember reading about this in a newspaper a while back. There was a Holocaust survivor, a young man at the time in Poland, who survived the killing of the 6 million Jews in the Holocaust, and that was good, of course. And he grew up, he came to America, he got a second chance, he became educated, actually became a psychiatrist, became a child psychiatrist, helped very many people through his life. Anyway, he got to be old, he developed some chronic disease, and he committed suicide at the end of his life. And it's odd to read about that, but it pinpoints what I'm talking about, the vulnerability of the very young and the very old to trauma, and it may set them up for PTSD. There's a couple other things. Pre-trauma catastrophic thinking. We are encouraged, I think, by our faith to have positive thinking. I find the Christian faith to be one of the most positive experiences of my life. All sorts of hope and faith and joy and love and wonderful concepts that I learned from my faith. And that's an insulator. That helps prevent response to trauma that would lead to PTSD. However, some people have the pre-trauma catastrophic thinking, where everything is doom and gloom all the time, and something bad is going to happen, and lo and behold it does, and then it plays out in their life and it leads to PTSD. Poor social support is another individual factor. We all need to support one another. I like the concept when I'm teaching children about this, that like trees in a forest, if all the roots of the trees interdigitate, then the trees will withstand the storm. If there's an individual tree out in the middle of a field, as you have seen in the recent storms, some of those are blown over. They don't have enough support. Well, we all need personal support too, don't we? There's a saying in Ecclesiastes that the threefold cord is not easily broken. And if you take 3 strings and wrap them around each other, it's hard to snap those strings. But if you have 1 string, it's easy to snap. So the idea of social support is very, very important. And finally, there's factors such as paternal or maternal PTSD. Over and over again, I see this in my work, where something has happened. Maybe the father served in Korea or World War II, the son serves in Vietnam, now another son is serving in Iraq and Afghanistan, and there's PTSD at each generational level, and almost like one is setting up the other. But there's certainly children learn from their parents, and if they see a parent suffering, that sets them up for PTSD. What we want to do is, in a setting like Aurora, Colorado, where they've had the Columbine disaster just in 1999, and now this disaster in 2012, we want to particularly deal with those people who, for whatever reason, got involved in both of those disasters. There's also the trauma response to trauma. And we mentioned this before, but certain traumas are less likely to cause PTSD than others. Actually, man-made trauma is more likely to cause it. So an incident like the Aurora shooting is more likely to result in PTSD. Sometimes a flood or a storm is less likely to cause that type of response. The perceived life threat, again at the community level, is something. I was surprised, by the storm that we went through in West Virginia. I was out of state. I was visiting, playing granddaddy, and I was visiting granddaughter in Michigan when the storm hit West Virginia. But I was surprised how widespread it was, that much of Ohio and West Virginia. Initially I heard all 55 counties of West Virginia involved. I think in the end they said 53 counties, but certainly very, very widespread, a perceived threat that went way, way, way across a lot of boundaries. And then there's the peritraumatic emotions of dissociation. Some people dissociate when they're in trauma. I mentioned the response earlier, the fight, the flee, or the freeze response. Well, the freeze response is often dissociation. People go elsewhere in their head. They may have amnesia even for the trauma after it's over. They just don't have it recorded in their brain to bring back and recall. And that sets people up for PTSD also if they do dissociate easily. And we all probably dissociate sometimes. If you want to think about it as a common brain function, think about daydreaming. I remember as a child I really enjoyed reading books, children's books and all sorts of books, Call of the Wild, learning about the Yukon and the Gold Rush. And I could go there in my head, and then if there was a sound in my room or the next room, I wasn't even aware of it. Maybe Mother would call me for supper. I was in my book. I was dissociating. I was daydreaming. I was inside my book. I could concentrate that way, and that's okay. That's a normal response. But things like that, sometimes when we can do that with trauma, it sets us up later for PTSD. And then there's negative cognition about the self and the world. It's going to be harder, isn't it? We're going through a hard time already as a nation economically. This is said to be the worst downturn since the Great Depression, and now we have these traumas like these shooting episodes, and all this accumulates, doesn't it? Our self-image in the world is changing, and so that's what makes us vulnerable. A couple more things to talk about in the remaining minutes. One of them, finally, is that in the current war that we're experiencing in Iraq and Afghanistan, we have a lot of people coming back with traumatic brain injury. They've been, bombs have exploded very close to their head, they've sustained concussion. That type of brain injury also then, along with the trauma, the horror of war, the fear response, the helplessness, sets people up for PTSD. There's a couple post-traumatic things as time passes that we also need to keep in mind, and I want to close with these. First of all, going forward, we need a lot of social support. I was so glad when I turned on the TV Sunday night and saw that they were having church services and memorial services, and they were gathering as a community, and the all faiths were said to be represented, various groups coming together at the Civic Center there in Aurora, and people were holding on to that, and that's a good thing. That's a part of a social support system. I imagine families have been trying to get in touch with each other, and some people who may live away from Aurora, Colorado, are traveling out there to be with their young ones, or having loved ones come to see them. So all sorts of social support is needed. The most common thing that I've heard about war is that when people come back to West Virginia after fighting a war, they'll go back to their family farm and they'll stay there for as long as 2 years. I mean, it's not uncommon, a year or 2 years before they want to venture out into the world again. But they have that social support, and that's a good thing that is here. I always tell folks nowadays, if you own a family farm, don't sell it. Your family needs that. The future generations need that. That's part of a social support system. Of course, there are subsequent life stresses. Life goes on. We don't know what will come next. But accumulation of life stresses, the double whammy, so to speak, from little Abner, can get us. And again, sometimes life stresses happen more than we want. We are going too fast in life. We need to slow down. We need to walk when we can. We need to exercise daily, get plenty of rest. People that are healthiest sleep about 10 hours. Most Americans, most West Virginians are getting 6.5 hours of sleep only. So we're going too fast. We don't sit down and eat our meals together as a family. All these things help us slow down our life and increase the quality of our life and lessen life stress. Stigma is another big factor. Certain traumas are more stigmatizing than others. I still hear this. I heard this yesterday from a soldier, from a veteran, coming back from Vietnam War and being spit upon and being called a baby killer. He was being stigmatized unfairly because he was a young man turning 18 in Vietnam, fighting for his country, in this case not able to do anything about world politics, but doing what was his patriotic duty, and then to be stigmatized. That hurt, and I think it set him up. I'm sure it set up other people for PTSD. There's community level supports. All this is needed. We are blessed in Buchanan. I've heard one time someone said we could call out any 3 letters and name an organizational meeting and a date and place, and people would show up. We have many, many organizations, and they all do great work for us, and we should belong to some of those. And then finally, parenting practices. In children, we don't want to be too controlling or too protective. Children have to experience life as it comes. There are, of course, developmental stages, and we don't want to hurry growing up, but again, we can't protect our children from everything, and we need not do that. I remember after 9/11, I was seeing a family, and the mother was very, very protective, and she was living way up in the woods in the country, but she was afraid to let her children out of their trailer for that summer, the following 9/11, because she thought some Arab or someone would come and kidnap her children. Of course, that was a remote event. It probably could never happen, but that overprotection, I think, was hurting her children at that time. But she was trying to be a good parent, but this is the overprotection I'm talking about. Well, there are many things we can learn, lessons from Aurora, Colorado. I've taken this opportunity to talk about PTSD and what we know about it. I hope it's been helpful. And if it is, I hope you tune in next week for our program, Tender Loving Care, which I'm glad that Channel 3 has made available to us. We'll see you next week.